Hi, and welcome to this week's lecture about accommodations and modifications. So one of the first things to talk about when it comes to accommodations and modifications is to look at what the law says. The federal and state laws and regulations require schools to provide accommodations and modifications to make sure that students with disabilities have access to an appropriate education program. So basically, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which we know mostly as IDEA, requires that students have the opportunity to be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum. So basically, accommodations and modifications are what allows and provides students with disabilities the opportunity to participate in a meaningful way and to basically meet their goals that are designed in their IEPs. Section 504 is another component that also protects students with disabilities. So if you qualify for a 504 plan from Section 504 of the rehabilitation program, then you can have a 504 plan, and that might include providing those accommodations, even if a student does not have an IEP. Americans with Disabilities Education Act of 1990 prohibits discrimination to any individuals with disabilities as well. So we're talking about IDEA, 504, and Americans with Disabilities Act. So looking at first, what I want to do is I'm going to just break down accommodations, and I'm going to break down modifications for you, and I'll be providing a lot of examples of those. And one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that they both provide students access to the general education curriculum in the same way that we would be providing students with without disabilities access to a curriculum. Now, keep in mind one thing is that prior to the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, students with disabilities were not really included at all in our schools. In fact, they were determined to be uneducable, and oftentimes they weren't in the classrooms or schools at all. They were in institutions or completely outside of that. So once we had individuals with disabilities into our schools through the passage of what was referred to as in 1975, it was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Now we call it IDEA. But back then, it was just about access. We just wanted them to be able to be educated in the environment where typically developing peers were. And then after that, as we've reauthorized over the years, it was looking more in terms of how we can make access more meaningful for students. And that comes in that area, it's basically accommodations and modifications make a big difference in that access. So accommodations, one thing that's really important to know is that they do not change, they should not change expectation to the curriculum grade levels. It's the actual teaching supports that students might require. So basically, accommodations is about access. It's about providing a student access to what the general education curriculum is. And it means changing how a student accesses information and demonstrates their learning. Really important to know is it does not substantially change the instructional level, content, or standard. So the information is the same, it's all about access. And any changes that are made in order to provide a student with equal access to learning and equal opportunity basically shows what he or she knows and what they can do. So its accommodations are making those changes so we give them access to be able to demonstrate proficiency in that area. So who can receive accommodations? This is just a little bit of humor, but let's talk about who actually is eligible to receive those accommodations. Basically, accommodations are certainly for students with a disability who have an IEP or a 504 plan. So just because you have an IEP doesn't mean you don't qualify for accommodations and you should automatically need something more significant like a modification. On the contrary, basically, if you qualify for an IEP or a 504, you can have accommodations. Also, students without a disability who might have barriers to learning. And then students who receive ELL services, English language support services, and students who are at risk of failure. All of those students are basically eligible to receive accommodations. Now we're going to talk about, so if we're risk of failure, English language learner, if you have an identified disability, or if you're at risk. All of those things make it really important. Now let's talk about modifications. And it's really, really important to point out that a lot of teachers confuse accommodations and modifications. So if you can walk away with a really good understanding of modifications versus accommodations by the end of today, then you will be far ahead of actually a lot of teachers that are out there. So modifications are different than accommodation in that they make changes to the curriculum expectations in order to meet the needs of the student. So instead of accommodations, which are about access, modifications are actually changing curriculum expectations. And so we're changing what they're expected to learn and how they're demonstrating that content area knowledge. What are modifications? They are made when the expectations are beyond the student's level of ability. So it's not about access anymore. The student doesn't need an alternative way to access the information. Instead, the student, basically the level of their ability is prohibiting them from meeting those expectations. So modifications are needed. It's also to alter the standard or what the test or assignment is supposed to measure. And then it can be very minimal or complex. So there's a really wide range in terms of what a modification might be necessary to meet a student's needs. And it all hinges on one major thing, and that's that student's performance. And it also has to be clearly acknowledged in an IEP if a student is being provided a modification. It needs to be written in the IEP so that IEP members know that it's there, including all educators and related service personnel who work with that student. So now, really, what's the difference between the two? Apples and oranges, and it might seem really clear cut right now, but sometimes when it comes to looking through different examples, we have a hard time identifying the difference between an accommodation and a modification. So I'm going to break it down a little bit more for you. So accommodations can apply to all students, whereas modifications apply to students with disabilities only. So accommodations do not fundamentally change any standards in terms of instructional level, content, or performance criteria, whereas modifications do fundamentally change those standards in terms of the instructional level, content, and performance criteria. Changes are made in order to provide equal access. So remember, accommodations are all about access, whereas modifications are about changes that are made to provide the student meaningful and productive learning experiences based on their needs and abilities. So we are changing the content, the delivery, or the expression that the student is required to complete in order to show that they're demonstrated some kind of standard, meeting that standard. Grading is the same for accommodations. Grading is different with modifications. So again, we are not changing anything fundamentally for accommodations, but with modifications we are. Here's some more differences. Accommodations focus on removing barriers, and again, really highlighting the word access. So if you have a hard time remembering the difference between the two, remember accommodations are about access. So A is access and accommodations, if that helps you remember it all. Whereas modifications focus on ensuring meaningful participation in the general ed curriculum. It's about participating in the curriculum, not necessarily access. Accommodations are also designed for students who have barriers that can be removed to help them demonstrate what they know. And modifications are designed for students who would benefit from participation in the general education curriculum, even though it might be above or different than their ability level. So if you think of it about the game of school, when it comes to accommodations and about access, and about modifications even, think about running a race. And if the goal is that everyone gets to the finish line, then that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to jump over hurdles to get to that finish line, because some people might be able to jump over the hurdles and some people might not be able to jump over hurdles at all. But either way, they're both getting to that finish line. So it's about keeping the big picture in mind as the same. Accommodations level the playing field so that it's more equal, again, that access. Whereas modifications, everyone plays. So it's about everyone having the opportunity to play, even if it's not at their ability level. They're finding a way to play at a different way than what their peers are doing. So looking at that sort of analogy of leveling the playing field, that means that knowledge of addition is demonstrated by maybe manipulating blocks instead of through writing. So we're still assessing and looking at their knowledge, but we're basically giving them better access to that. We're not changing the criteria at all. Or we might have extra textbooks provided for a child who might need more organizational assistance. There might be a student who might not be able to take notes themselves, so a scribe might be provided. They might have multiple choice facts instead of fill in the blank. They might be given guided notes prior to an auditory lecture so they can follow along. It's all about access. Again, they do not change knowledge content. Modification, everyone plays. That might mean that while everyone is working on multiplication, that child is still doing math with their typically developing peers, only they're not at the level to do multiplication. Instead, they're doing addition while their classmates are doing multiplication. Or if students are reading chapter books and a student's not at that level, then they might be learning letters and sounds while their classmates read chapter books. Or the entire class might read a chapter book, whereas a student might read more of a Cliff Notes version of that chapter book. So they're still doing that same sort of content topic, but it's not the same level or degree of difficulty as the other peers. A child might use blocks to build structures while other students are doing science experiments. Or a student might be given a test on continents while their classmates are tested on countries in Europe. So again, it's a difference, but everyone's playing together. They do change the knowledge and content or the standard, but everyone's there together learning. They're all playing in the same game. Who's responsible for this? What does this mean? Who does accommodations? Who does modifications? An accommodation is really the how of the curriculum. So it's how are we going to meet that? How are we going to address that? Whereas the modification is the what of the curriculum. So the how is how are we going to get the information to the child and how are we going to test their knowledge? Whereas the modification is what part of the general education does the student need to know to reach his or her fullest potential. So if we're looking at math access, like we said, some of this, I described earlier, some students might be doing multiplication, but a student might be doing addition because we want to make sure that we're getting them access to that general ed math curriculum. It's a different level, but it's still math curriculum access. And who is ultimately responsible? It's both the general ed teacher and the special education teacher that are really responsible for making those accommodations and modifications using a collaborative problem-solving approach together. So who can receive modifications? Those are for students who have been traditionally pulled out, maybe in a separate program, or students who may have a low incidence disability, so they might be more significant needs. Students whom accommodations have been implemented to the fullest extent and they still have difficulty succeeding. So this is when really the rubber kind of really meets the road. If you've been providing ample opportunities for accommodations in a classroom and that student is still struggling, then we need to look at changing it a little bit more and giving them more of an opportunity to be successful by changing and modifying that curriculum. So remember, one of the most important things is the IEP or the 504 determines how a student will participate, not whether a student will participate. So there's never a conversation of can they participate? Of course they can. It's about how are we going to get them access. Again, it's all about that least restrictive environment. It's all about educating students with disabilities to the maximum extent possible as their peers. So I'm just going to pull up some of these frequently asked questions because I want this PowerPoint to be available for you to go through on your own. But I'm going to have this available for you to see. Who determines modifications? The IEP team. And that is something you're going to learn a lot more as we come into forthcoming units. But that includes local education representatives, special educator, general ed, parent, legal guardian, the student, and related service professionals. Who gets accommodations and modifications? We covered this already, but just to remind you, accommodations can be made for any student. Any student can have those accommodations. Students with an IEP or 504 get accommodations that are required. Students with an IEP can receive modifications if needed, and students determine whether they need both. So it all depends on the student's needs. How do I have to accommodate? If a student has an IEP or a 504 plan, then yes, you must provide those accommodations or modifications. If a student does not have an IEP or a 504, you're not required to accommodate, but it is considered best practice, especially for those students who are ELL, English language learners, or at risk, or going through the response to intervention multi-tiered systems of support evaluation. And then what do I say when a student says it's not fair? Because that happens a lot. Students will say, it's not fair that he gets this and I don't get that. And that's when we say that fair does means that everyone gets what they need to succeed. Fair doesn't always mean equal. And that's a really important thing to kind of always have in your mind. And students get it pretty quickly if you explain that. So some accommodations and modifications are just kind of to give you an idea of the areas where they're most often applied. It's with scheduling and timing. They might have an alternative schedule. They might have more time in a particular topic. A setting. They might be able to sit by themselves or sit with a group of peers or do peer buddies. Materials. They might use different materials. They might use manipulation blocks, or they might use, like I had said, more of a leveled reading. Instruction, you might be providing instruction where you're not only doing oral lecture, but a student has guided notes as well. That would be an accommodation of access. Student response, students might be able to, for an accommodation, be able to provide their information in multiple choice instead of fill in the blank. Or for a student who's doing a report, a student might have to write an entire paper, whereas another student might be able to, modification might be able to draw a picture or do a diorama of a different version of that story or book. And that might include that presentation that I just talked about. And here's a big example, and it's kind of not really showing up here, but this PowerPoint, again, is available for you to go through. But it goes through the 9 types of curriculum adaptations, and in it, there's examples of each one. So I'll leave this here just for you to look at briefly, and then you can go through this on your own later. So once we put this all together, what does this mean? The goal is always to remove barriers to learning and demonstrate mastery. So we really want students to be able to overcome those barriers. Accommodations keep the standards substantially the same, but the outcomes might vary. Whereas modifications fundamentally change the standard, but instructional level or content may vary as well, but we're still keeping them in that game. Expectations remain high for all students. So remember, accommodations mean we're leveling the playing field with that access. Modification means everyone gets to play in the game. It might just look different. So that concludes my brief lecture about the difference between accommodations and modifications. I hope that helps clarify things. I hope you're able to see the difference. Feel free to go through this PowerPoint on your own individually. And also, don't forget there's a nice reading available for the accommodations and modifications manual as well, where it really walks you through those different steps also. So that is all for now, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.